And hey, we're back now. So now we're going to get into the depths of Reconstruction. So let's see. We're going to break down this essential question right here: how well the goals of the war were achieved. So to do that, we're going to talk about some laws and events we should understand first. It's important to know what carpetbaggers and scalawags are. Carpetbaggers were white Northerners who moved to the South, many being former Union veterans. Scalawags were Southern whites supporting Republicans to regain their political influence and promote economic expansion. These two groups of people contributed to the influence of Southern Republicans in the nation at this time, and they also helped promote black rights, such as creating the Freedmen's Bureau. This was created as a government program establishing schools, reuniting families, providing food for people, and healthcare. And they also funded schools and teachers for those schools. They created courts to protect black rights. They also created several bills and had um, several other measures that some of them were vetoed by Andrew Johnson but were overturned by Congress, and this expanded the role of the Freedmen's Bureau and helped gain greater rights for black people. We also want to know what the Union League is. The Union League was a club that was the voice of former slaves, attracted them to the Republican Party, and also supported freedom for them. And the chapters came together to promote the ending of legal discrimination. So there are also several economic measures, land acts, such as the Morrill Tariff Act, the Homestead Act, and the Morrill Land Grant Act. These all pushed westward expansion and promoted land settlement to the west. And they're easy to be passed by Republicans during the war since there were no Democrats to oppose it. Now let's go into some of the problems of Reconstruction. We just talked about some of the way African Americans were helped, such as by the Freedmen's Bureau, but there are also many problems with Reconstruction that hindered the efforts of Reconstruction. So much of the tensions and differences that led to the Civil War still existed after the war, because the principles of slavery, where black people were oppressed, still existed, and Southern Democrats were being bitter about their defeat. Many of them started believing in and spreading ideas of the lost cause. This was an ideology that believed that the Confederacy was heroic, and they presented the Confederacy positively, in a positive manner. And other ways that blacks were discriminated against were through the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and other laws such as the Black Codes. These restricted rights of African Americans. And although the codes were shut down as Reconstruction progressed, the very concepts represented by them were achieved by Jim Crow laws later in the 20th century. So it can be seen that these ideas still come back and are still affecting African Americans, even though it was a century later, or almost half a century later. So there's also the grandfather clause. It stated that if one's grandfather couldn't vote, an individual could not vote as well. So basically denied all African Americans that were free from slavery from being able to vote. And then there are also literacy tests and poll taxes implemented by state constitutions, which restricted African Americans from voting. And all these were tactics to spread fear and intimidation, which did work in, unfortunately, in preventing active voting from occurring in many of these elections at the time. Sharecropping is an important key term to know. It's a way where freedmen were stuck in debt and couldn't reach their financial independence after the war because they would have to work in terms of the landlord and follow a strict contract, forcing them to conform with the system and share their portion of their production and have to pay rent. Now we're going to go into women's rights. So women were also affected by this, but not as much as African Americans. So the right to vote was still denied to women, and the roles of women were still subordinate to men. Many women did see expansion in their job roles as being nurses and fulfilling other roles in the economy as a result of the men going off to war during the Civil War. But many of them still were discriminated in gender roles, and these different aspects of discrimination were still apparent after the war. Lincoln's speech, he states in the Emancipation Proclamation that 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. However, Lincoln and the Republicans, they did fight for African American equal rights, but the idea of women's equal rights didn't resonate enough, and they didn't really stand up for women's rights in the same sense until the 20th century, when the struggle for women's rights continued and they finally gained the right to vote and various other equal rights. So now we're going to talk about the end of Reconstruction. So the Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction, and it basically it was an agreement between the two presidential candidates and to end Reconstruction if President Hayes became the president. So Hayes was elected president, and then the military presence in the South was removed. And that also ended many of the Reconstruction Acts that used to protect former slaves. They became nullified in the South, a lot of them. So a lot of the work that was done was basically erased because of this. And African Americans' rights weren't really protected and were failed to be protected because Democrats were still dominating the South, and the military presence wasn't there to enforce the laws that were being created during the time. And much of this is because of the liberal Republicans. They were Republicans who supported economics and limited government. They wanted to move on from focusing on black rights, and they went more focused on the economy and emphasis on producing their own wealth and gaining benefits off of it. And the war successfully achieved many of its goals, but it did nothing to settle the hostility and differences between these two groups, the Republicans and Democrats. And the main point that should be made here is that the Civil War and Reconstruction, it did a lot to help promote African American rights, and it did in fact reunite the United States. So it was a huge success in many ways. Also, slavery was settled and it was abolished for good. So those were all good aspects that accomplished goals. Those were accomplished goals of the Civil War. However, the ending of slavery and reunification of the nation, it didn't mean immediate nationalism and unity. There were still sectional differences that hadn't been worked out. And this ideology of Republicans versus Democrats, it still exists today as part of American politics. And the discrimination and oppression of rights are still occurring today too, just in different forms. So all of this is still very relevant to our society today. And Civil War, even if you think it was a long time ago and that's not really relevant today, a lot of the same principles and ideas affected our nation, and so it's very important to be knowledgeable of that. Most importantly, the war that helped define the integrity that the American democracy holds still has lasting effects on the principles of us as a society today. I want that to resonate in your head and think about that for a moment. And I hope you learned a lot from this podcast today. And we'll leave you with this quote that we have on the screen, President Lincoln's famous Emancipation Proclamation. Hope you have a great day. If you're a new viewer, subscribe and like the video. And keep tuning in to our future podcasts. We have more coming along on the way. Hope you liked our visual aids to enhance our presentation today. And hopefully we'll be doing more of that in the future. Have a great day, everyone. This is Nathan signing off from the History Bros podcast.